I'm going to go through this really, really quickly because I think it's interesting, and the reason why it could be good for us as people to think about the research that's been done is that it allows us to relax a little bit. I think one of the big takeaways in this part of this is for us to start to believe that we're not alone in the grammar struggle, and that none of the issues that our students evidence in terms of grammar, mechanics, or anything like that can be solved in 15 weeks. So if we work more together, more collaboratively across classes, and there's more writing and writing instruction going on in their classes, we're going to get this stuff solved, but it's never going to happen in 15 weeks. Here was something that was done in 1963. It was a huge meta-analysis of over 500 published studies of research on error. And the conclusion was teaching of formal traditional grammar has negligible, or because it usually displaces some instruction and practice in actual composition, even a harmful effect on the improvement of writing. The meta-analysis is a statistical test for assigning and uniformly weighing experimental research in composition, and in fact in any field, where you can take the various results of different kinds of studies and use different kinds of, I'm totally out of my depth here, t-tests or whatever, chi-squares, I don't know what it is, to come up with how they're speaking to each other. This was reproduced in 1986, the same kinds of results. A meta-analysis, once again, of about 100 different studies. Taught in certain ways, and that's the thing here. Grammar and mechanics instruction has a deleterious effect on student writing. In some studies, a heavy emphasis results in significant losses of overall quality. Now, why is this? Well, we'll talk about that. This is why. Because people are teaching traditional school grammar. And traditional school grammar doesn't help students to write better. The ways that we were taught, they didn't work on us. We just think they did. And in fact, we were in first grade and we didn't know. We're not good. Well, for the most part, these kinds of acontextual activities, this is what they're talking about when they say the teaching of traditional or formal grammar often involve rules that are abstracted from students' real writing, grammar and mechanics worksheets or quizzes or proofreading exercises, and it's a shame sentence diagramming doesn't do a damn thing. Because I love sentence diagramming. I think it's fun. Putting, noun phrases and trees and stuff, and there's two different ways to do it. There's the old school way and there's the new. I love it. I think it's fun, right? It doesn't do anything. Another thing, marking every error doesn't help. It just overloads students, and focusing on correctness instead of communication will block students in terms of writing. It'll block them up. They won't be able to do both things at the same time, because what we know about writing is it's a tremendously cognitively complex task. And if they're trying to spit out what they mean at the same time as put it into a language that everybody can understand, making it correct, they're more likely to block. So some more recent research. This is 1986, the same year. 3,000 teacher-marked papers they selected at random out of 21,000 that they gathered. It's not fun. They did it all in one summer. The results include finding that college English teachers do not always agree on what's a serious writing error. Teachers mark only 43% of the most serious errors, and we only mark the ones for which there are easy fixes, and not the more complicated ones. They reproduced this in 2006, and one of the things that was interesting about this, the re-study, was that the top 20 errors changed. And why did they change? Well, we can compare. In 1986, there were no spell checkers. In 2006, there are. In this one, you notice the spelling wasn't on the list. That's because it was so frequent, so regular, that they took it and set it aside. They said, we're not even going to count spelling because everybody's misspelling everything all the time. Spelling actually got a little better, but wrong word was the number one. And why? It's things like defiantly or definitely. And students know what defiant means, and they know what definite means. But it's easier to type defiant. On a QWERTY keyboard, I will always type T-E-H. Always. And I have auto-corrected in my Microsoft Word for my habit. right? So I've fixed Microsoft Word for me, but I will always type TEH, and I don't know why. It's just easier, and I know how to spell the, you know? And this is the kind of thing that what we have to do, and this is my argument here, I'll talk about this really quickly. So this is what we know about language acquisition. It's really hard. It takes a long time. It takes 10 years to learn a language. Most of it is informal, not formal. Most of it is by being in language communities. It's by being spoken to by your parents. It's by being in communities where language is used in a particular kind of way. Like in grad school, where we first learned, all of our English graduate students are having a freak out right now because they don't know the form of the thesis. Well, they've never seen a thesis before. And deeper than that, they don't know what a thesis does. They don't understand the weight that we put on it in the field and the ways that the conventions that we use, the 5-chapter kind of format, speak to the values of the beliefs in our discipline. So it's about academic discourse at its root. It's about introducing students to discipline-based kind of quasi-dialects of English. And academic discourse is nobody's mother tongue, right? We don't come born with academic discourse in us. We put it on. So what to do, I think the best thing to do is to let some of the errors go, frankly. And what I'm arguing here is that the first two, we shouldn't penalize students for. For the most part, those mistakes and omissions will get taken care of in successive drafts. Idiomatic expressions characterized by kind of language choices like a car cut in front of me and I gave him the horn, right, instead of I honked at him. Those things get removed, right? What we need to concentrate on are these two things. Evidence of interlanguage, that is, they have one language set of structures or one set of ideas that make sense to them, procedures for making language work, and they're asked to do another one, and they're kind of moving between them in interesting and predictable ways. Or, even more than that, regular patterns of error, which are really the application of a rule rather than the absence of one. It just turns out to be the wrong rule. You know? We have rules for certain kinds of grammatical and syntactical forms in English. When students misproduce those, their rule is wrong. So what we have to do is to craft different kinds of ways to force the wrong rule to the surface and to target it. If you can get your students to say things like, I always thought what you did was, or I always thought the rule was, like, tell me what a passive voice is to you, could be an interesting question. Isn't a passive voice every time people say it was something? You know, I mean, yeah. Pass versus passive, right? So taking this same example, what I've started to do is to work with several things. I'm interested in the use of the verb here, learned, because it seems to me to be a pattern that she's using in different kinds of ways. And I'm also very interested in her nouns. I mean, I'm focusing on the nouns and the verbs. I think if that's the first step that we take, is probably a really good step. So she doesn't pluralize, and that's very, very common. So here's one suggestion, minimal marking. And we know a lot about minimal marking. It doesn't work as well for English language learners, but it works great for people who are native speakers. All you do is get the slide to advance, is something like this. When you see an error in the line, just mark it and move on. And make them fix it before they can turn in the draft again. And don't tell them what it is, because they can find it on their own. You have a handbook in your class, or you have the Purdue OWL, which is an online writing lab, which has all of the things to do in it. And just mark it and move on. Now, what this person is doing right here is, these are content squigglies. I don't agree with your content in some way. These are problems in the line that need to be fixed. You could even make this more minimal if you wanted to. Do this for the first page. And then now apply the kinds of things that you've done in the first page to the rest of your draft. Even if it's 10 pages long, start to do that. That's a really good strategy, and it's a time saver too. And what you'll see in terms of my suggestions are things that are less time consuming, that is, might even save you time, to things that are far more time consuming. This is another one that I've used in the past. student-to-teacher memos that are specifically focused on grammar. Review the last comments that I made on your draft. What resources have you used in order to learn more about that, and how have you addressed them? Is asking them to be reflective about their language choices, and that could be good too. Those don't need to be graded, just required. And you can read them really quickly, and it'll give you a sense of how they're incorporating your comments into their new draft, which is really good in terms of teaching writing anyway. We want to make sure that they, and set up structures in the class, to make sure that they don't write something new without consulting what you've told them in the past. Otherwise, they're just going to take a look at the grade and they're going to chuck it in the can or the circular file, and they're never going to look, and all that time you've spent marking up there, obsessively bleeding on their paper, will be wasted, right? So we have to encourage a structure that will make them return to those earlier comments. Playing on the top 20 errors assignments, you could ask students to keep an error log. My students hated me for doing this, but I used it in classes where students were going to be future teachers, so I thought it was important that they know how to diagnose and fix. So they copy the original sentence that I marked, they list the rule that fixes it, and then they list the new version of the sentence, and it pulls out as an actual assignment. I give them points for it, for doing something like that. And they have to do it across all of the work that they do in my class. And I'll just minimal mark to tell them what's going on in that sentence, and then they have to put all of those into an error log. This is not something I ever need to look at, really, until the end of the semester, when I take a look at them really quickly and make sure that they're doing it right. You can also use GradeMark and PeerMark to do this kind of work. GradeMark and PeerMark are part of the Turnitin suite that we have on campus. And what it allows you to do is to select different and create different buttons. I'm sorry about the fuzziness of this, but select and create different buttons for the things that you think are most important in students' writing, and then just tag their paper with those buttons. What you can also do is you can hot link these buttons so that when they click on them, some kind of new screen might open that would take them to the Purdue OWL or to some other kind of resource that could help them actually diagnose and fix. And we have it, it's free, it's part of Turnitin, it's easily importable into Vista, well, Vista's dying, Blackboard Learn, and other kinds of things like this. And it allows you to do even more than, this is more than minimal, right? Because what it does is it tells them what the error is, and it also gives them a resource for fixing it. But then you won't, I would argue, accept a new draft of the paper until these things have been taken care of. Same kind of thing going on here. You can highlight, you can leave comments, or you can what they call quick mark, which are these buttons up here. Just say, hey, this is what I'm seeing in the draft, and we'll need to talk about it. And the emphasis in this is not evaluation, right? They don't get an F just for having a certain number of errors, but just that they know that you're watching, you're paying attention to the kinds of things that they're doing, and you're noting the patterns of error that you see in their paper and asking them to fix them. An assignment that I've given in my classes is asking students based on that top 20 list to become an expert in one error. Now, this is a writing class that, I teach all writing classes. For content classes, so-called, it might be harder to do something like this, but whole class workshops then can pass papers around in a circle, and you could imagine that that paper gets looked at in 20 different ways based on the 20 top errors. And it may be very quick. You have no errors that are pronoun referent. Pass it on, right? So you could actually ask them to give 5-minute presentations on avoiding that error in their own work. Have them, put together something that might be fun and interesting to listen to, and ask students to apply it to a draft that they're working on. Here's another one really quickly. I stole this from Tom Fox, who's in our department. He won't accept drafts. Oh, I don't know if that's true. But he does have self-editing sheets for each of the drafts that they write for his class, and they get progressively more complex. So you see in the first one, it's possessives, commas, and homonyms. Just look for those things. Next one, those 3 plus semicolons and documentation. And then a third one later on, those 5 plus a couple of more things. Now you notice what this goes from is very easily fixed things to things that are a little more genre-based, discipline-based, and so on. Documentation, MLA, APA style, is not related to one particular kind of grammar or mechanics. It's conventions of a discipline. And this down here, dropped quotations would be just putting a quote, he means it literally, putting a quote in a paper without any attribution tags at the beginning, something like according to Mickey Lennon in religious studies, comma, who studied this for years, comma, you know. Getting those kinds of things down, I think, is important too, but it moves beyond the scope of just grammar and mechanics. And then finally, if you wanted to, and this is the most time-consuming of all, is you make copy editing an actual assignment in your class. Not for every draft, just for a couple of drafts, let's say. Informal writing doesn't need to be well copy edited, but a few formal writing assignments, you could say you earn a certain number of points for doing the work, the content work, and you'll earn some more points for a copy editing day or workshop or activity that we'll do in class. And they either get those points or they don't. It becomes a kind of a credit or no credit assignment. It's a blunt yes or no requirement. You don't want to grade these things. That would waste time. How well they proofread is obviously, people get better and better at proofreading. I think that's generally true. But you want to make this a blunt yes or no requirement in order to save yourself time, in order to teach students that this is one of the things that they're going to need to do across all of their papers in the future. So this is a kind of a pull-out assignment that operates according to the kinds of structures that you might set up in your class. The way that this person did it, it's accompanied with mini lessons in usage, making better use of spell check and grammar check, doing lots of reading out loud, holding short conferences. These are all kinds of things that you can do in order to lessen the paper load. In fact, there might be stacks of papers. If you're asking them to revise them already, why wouldn't you just pull them in conferences and talk to them for 10 minutes apiece, rather than even putting one pen mark on the paper? Here are the kinds of things I'm seeing. Here's what's good. For the next draft, work on these 2 or 3 things. And that might actually save some time. So the takeaways, I think we're already on the same page about. But all of this relates back to the kinds of things that I was saying at the beginning about setting up a process-based class. That is, grammar instruction works best when it's in the context of students' own writing. This is not controversial anymore. Anything outside of their own writing, they won't see the immediate transfer or the applicability to their own writing, or we won't have made that easy for them to abstract what they did over here and apply it to their own writing. If we can give them models of good writing and ask them to experiment, give them lots of opportunities to write, give them lots of reading, because this is one of the things that we know about the reading-writing connection, is there's nothing better in terms of English language learners and their ability to process English in ways that we value than reading and reading some more and reading some more. Reading obsessively really, really helps. And then different kinds of mini lessons or conferences that might enable people to be more careful editors of their own writing. So those are just some things that I was thinking of that I could draw out that might be useful for you all. I've seen this across all of your writing. You all seem to be, fill in the blank, using too many passives or having trouble with subject-verb agreement or pronoun antecedent, kinds of issues. And then explain to them and then ask them very quickly to take a look at the draft that they just turned into you or to do something like that to note that they have done it. Like I said, a lot of these are, pretty time-consuming. Some of them are time-sucking, especially the ones that would actually make copy editing an assignment in your class, that would demand workshops and drafting process that would last the entire semester. But I still think with 2 drafts, if you gave them several things that you'd like them to work on, either for the next draft of an essay that you've given them or for the next essay, then you can hold them responsible for having done that stuff, saying, I told you the last time. So I would imagine that it would be very easy, for example, to do something along the lines of a student-to-teacher memo that asks them specifically to reflect on how they have fixed the things that you noted in their last paper or their last draft and applied it to this new paper or this new draft. And that would be scannable. You wouldn't have to read every word. You could look at it very quickly, and then you'd hold them responsible. And you could actually, if you wanted to, return the paper to the students saying, I'm still seeing those things that I asked you to do last time, fix it up, and return it to me when it's done. That doesn't take long for them. There are resources on campus like the Student Learning Center, and all kinds of online resources like Grammar Check, like we talked about, GradeMark, PeerMark, other kinds of things like that that can help them do that kind of work. So it may make working with papers a little bit messy because you have some papers that are ready to go and ready for you to comment on and return to them, and some that might come in a couple hours or days later. But I could imagine something like that wouldn't be too time consuming for you. And it may be that you have several strategies that you pull from this. There's some combination of minimal marking and some student-to-teacher memos that wouldn't be a huge time suck on your end. And I'm a big believer in what educational people call the gradual release of responsibility model. That is, for the first paper, you might be a little obsessive about the responses that you give. You take some extra time to point out the patterns of error that you see and the other kinds of content things that they need to work on, right? But then as the semester progresses, you're pulling back. You're giving them less to work with, and you're maybe employing some kind of peer review strategy outside of class that doesn't have to interfere with class time at all. And you, in successive drafts, if you employ a draft model, can say, I made these same comments last time, and that's all you say. I'm not going to accept another draft until you go look at the first set of comments that I gave. And you won't have a chance to improve your grade at all unless you do those kinds of things. So I think it's a matter of setting up the structures in class that would flush these kinds of concerns out, giving them resources or structures in class to actually get that kind of stuff done, or outside of class, and then pulling back and making sure you hold them responsible for doing it. I don't think it has to be too time-consuming. And I do think a lot of this stuff can get solved, now not on a one-class basis, but over the course of 4 or 5 or even 6 years, their writing is going to get better and is going to get cleaner. And this is one of the things that makes grammar so confounding, is because we have such strong beliefs about it. Whenever somebody talks about higher education, it seems they focus on the grammatical infelicities of our students and then slash our budget by $200 million, right? It's one of those things. But the more you learn about it, the more we see different kinds of ways in which content and structure are related. So for example, there's some new research that's showing that when students don't know what they're talking about, their grammar also goes to hell. Which is interesting, right? Because when I don't know what I'm talking about, and I know this is true, I've given workshops this semester where this has happened, I suddenly lose my place, and then I'm talking in broken sentences. I don't know how I'm speaking to people anymore, right? I'm having trouble keeping the two things in my mind at the same time. That is, what I'm saying, why it means, how I should communicate it to somebody else, and then how to put it in a syntactical structure that would make sense to people. And so that's interesting. It gives us a new kind of way to understand that grammar, that is the structure of language, and content are related. So you might ask yourself, and this is one of the things that might be going on, and I kind of stop myself, I kind of double check now when I'm reading papers. If something suddenly stands out to me as immediately evidencing a whole bunch of grammatical problems, I look at the position of the paragraph in the paper and the kind of the argument that they're trying to make and wonder, now maybe it's not true, but wonder if there's something going on, that they're getting lost in their argument and it's just coming out in terms of grammar. Because we have to make sure that they know that we're serious about these kinds of things and that they have the responsibility of doing it. So that can work in different kinds of ways, but I think that there has to be some kind of attention paid to, you didn't do what I asked you to do last time, let's get that done. And I'll read your draft once you do these things, and I'm not going to penalize you in the meantime, but it needs to be done before I'm going to read it. So yeah, it makes it complicated. You need to sit on your hands. You really just, and it's hard for me too. But a lot of that effort could be wasted if we don't have structures in place to make sure that they look at those comments and fix them. A professor once got really mad at me because I suggested that all this time, when he didn't allow redrafting or revising at all, that all this time that he was obsessing over and line editing his students' papers, that a lot of that was wasted. Because if he didn't have a kind of a structure in place where students would have to return to those comments that he'd made, then they won't look at them. We have to encourage that, in fact, force that to come to the surface. More and more, I think the incubation, the period before you start writing, what you would call, I guess, pre-writing or planning, is really important too, so that students don't just start to write without having done research, homework, done their interviews, done different kinds of stuff. They have a wealth of information to draw on. But then I often kind of wait to see what they have produced and then work from revision. So how are we going to revise this draft? Because most of the interesting new approaches that they take, or the places where they actually start to break apart a paper and put it back together in a different form, happen in revision. A lot of the great writing that we see happens through that revision process. Yeah, the real learning happens in revision.